Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of It Depends podcast. I am honored to have George Fraser, co-founder, CEO of Fivetran, join us. Fivetran, almost all of you know, it embodies a new breed of companies in the modern data stack space. Interestingly, we are recording this episode within days of Matt Turk's 2023 edition of the MAD landscape, which is literally bursting from its seams with old and new product offerings. Fivetran, on the other hand, is an OG. It is one of the early components of modern data stack when it introduced its cloud-based approach to data integration using pre-built connectors that are continuously updated, so they stay compatible with each source. So I'm not going to steal any thunder from George. We are excited to hear his views on modern data stack and all the things in between. So George, so glad you could join us.
Thank you for that welcome. Wonderful to be with you.
Perfect. So George, let's get started with some introduction. Can you please tell us your journey so far and where you are?
Sure. Before starting Fivetran, I was a scientist, actually. I started the company with my co-founder, Taylor Brown, who I've known my whole life, a long time, family friends. And it's been quite a journey we've been on. It's been just over 10 years. So we started the company at the end of 2012. So it's been like 10 years and a couple months. We were in Y Combinator in winter of 2013, which was instrumental in setting the pace and setting the direction of the company early on. Our original product idea was not right. And we did go through a process of iteration in the first couple of years. But ultimately, we did find product market fit and got our first customer in March of 2015. It's been bug fixing ever since.
Wow. So George, I'm curious, what was your original idea when you and Taylor thought about starting a company? And then what was the catalyst that pivoted you into the data integration space?
Well, the original idea was to make a vertically integrated data analysis environment that went all the way from getting the data from the source, which is, of course, the thing we ended up finding product market fit with, to centralizing the data in a data warehouse that was hidden behind the scenes, and then interacting with that data through a UI. And the UI took a series of different forms in the first couple of years. That was the main thing that we were iterating on. So at one time, it looked like a super powered spreadsheet. At one time, it was more like a BI tool. And what ended up happening was we were using Redshift under the hood as the compute engine of this thing. For those who don't know, I mean, Redshift was this huge phenomenon in 2013, 14. Yeah. It was the fastest growing product in AWS's history at the time. And it was not the first product of its kind. It was a data warehouse, like many that came before it. And Redshift is probably more. There's been more development since then. So I'm not describing Redshift today. I'm describing Redshift at the time. But it was fast and it was cheap, and you could launch it in the AWS console. And so it absolutely took off. And there were all of these companies, many of them Bay Area technology companies, who were setting up their very first data warehouse in the form of Redshift. And a lot of these people we were talking to, trying to get them to use what we were working on. Mm-hmm. And, generally the reaction was like, hey, I don't really like your half-baked BI tool, but, I have my own Redshift cluster and my own plan for what to do with the data. And I like the sound of these connectors that are built into your product. Like that's the problem I'm really facing, is actually getting data into this system. And can I just get that without the rest of it? And eventually, we heard this enough times, we said yes to one of them, and that became the product. That was product market fit.
So in 2012, Redshift had just been introduced. So right from day one, you had no intentions of being on-prem. Correct me if I'm wrong. It was always going to be a cloud-based product?
That is correct.
I see. Since you must have been one of the first few people taking Redshift through its paces? I'm guessing, were there like problems, like were you helping develop or provide recommendations to Redshift on what they should be doing? How was it?
No, not in the first couple of years. I mean, we were just trying to build a product on top of it, but we didn't really have any customers. Nobody really thought anything of us, and
Right.
so we had we were nothing special from AWS's perspective. Um, and then, as we started to get customers, um, it we were writing data to a lot of different Redshift clusters, and we certainly made our share of bug reports. These data warehouses, and this kind of gets into like why maybe Fivetran didn't happen earlier. These data warehouses, historically, it was expected that they would be operated by a DBA,
Mhm.
and a human being like can only write so many alter table statements. But the thing is, our whole vision was of automated data management, right? So when you connect Fivetran, you connect the source, you connect the destination, and if you add a column or change a type in the source, we're just going to go do that in the destination. We're going to push that through, um, and these sources change a lot. So we end up generating a kind of high number of schema changes. As it is, we do millions of schema changes a month across the fleet today. It's a huge number, and at first it barely worked. I mean, you could tell that like this was not really how the creators of these systems had intended them to be used. They imagined every data pipeline was going to be bespoke and operated by human beings, and so we took this sort of like automated fire hose and plugged it into them, and they definitely struggled in the early years. But the customers we were serving then were mostly fairly small customers with relatively modest data volumes, and so it worked well enough. And then Redshift got better, and then Snowflake came along, and BigQuery got better, and um, and so over 2015, 16, 17, the underlying infrastructure, this pattern we were doing of automated data integration, it worked for small companies, and all of our customers were small at the beginning, so that was okay. And then as the years went by, the underlying infrastructure got better, and so the same strategy worked for larger and larger and larger companies. And now we have some of the world's largest companies use us to manage their data. So now it really works for everyone.
Yeah. How many customers do you have now at Fivetran?
A little over 5,000 now.
I see. And how many connectors?
I think it's about like 500 connectors now. The pace has really increased recently. We've developed a new way of building connectors that is particularly for the long tail of connectors is much more efficient. And so we're able to build connectors much faster than we used to.
That's great to hear, because we are also seeing increase in the number of data sources. It's like I think there's studies that show even a small medium-sized company now has something like 110 SaaS products, and large ones are like 450, 500 SaaS products. So
yeah, and you don't necessarily need to have all of that data in your data warehouse. There are some SaaS tools where it's perfectly fine that the data is not in your data warehouse, like our Gmail account. We don't put that in the data warehouse. But a lot of those tools, your HRIS system, your CRM system, your event collecting system for data about what customers are doing on your website and your product, and if you're a physical world company, you've got some sort of ERP system where you're keeping track of like where are all the widgets. All those things really do need to go into your data warehouse, and it becomes a mammoth problem, especially when you talk about companies, larger, older companies that have made a lot of acquisitions. Oftentimes when you look at their IT infrastructure, it's like an archaeological expedition through all of their acquisitions. You find out that there's 25 different ERP systems that from the 25 different companies that were acquired over the last few decades.
Right. Correct. Yeah. So, so one of the newer things that got introduced in this modern data stack was we moved from ETL to ELT, and then reverse ETL came into the picture. How do you make sense of like what's trending? What do you think are the key differences, and what should the listeners focus on?
It has definitely evolved over the last 10 years. It's sort of interesting how that evolution took place. You know, Fivetran's original gambit, if you will, is that we could build an automated data pipeline that would deliver the same schema regardless of the desires or the needs of the customer, right? It's automated, so you get what you get in the data warehouse. It'll have your custom fields and whatever, but you have no ability to control this process. So the upside of that is it's really fast to set up and it's really easy to operate. There's really just like nothing for you to do. It just runs itself. The downside of that is like, well, there's no customizability. And the gambit that we made was like, well, they could do the customization afterwards. We deliver the data in a normalized format that they don't control, and then they can just apply a secondary layer of transformation. And all of our original customers in the first, well, not all of them, but in let's say the first 6 months, even the first year, the majority of them were Looker users, which is a BI tool that was taking off again amongst small technology companies largely at the time. And Looker had this capability to model the data. It had a relatively thick modeling layer compared to most BI tools. And so the kind of original modern data stack was Fivetran, Redshift, Looker. And then, there were new companies came along that took our same philosophy, and other data warehouses got into that game. And then on the BI side, what's interesting that has happened is that function of like modeling has really gotten captured by a new tool called DBT, which has become incredibly popular in the last few years. And it's basically created another layer. So whereas before it was a 3-layer stack, right? Data integration, data warehousing, and BI, now it's a 4-layer stack. You have a transformation layer that sits between your BI tool and your data warehouse. There are other things, there's data quality tools, there's data catalogs, there's reverse ETL. I don't know that any of them have yet demonstrated that kind of broad mainstream appeal. It's like really every company that does things with data has a BI tool. It has basically 100% adoption in the category of BI. Same goes for data warehousing, same goes for data integration. Transformation is on its way, I think. Having a distinct transformation layer between your BI tool and your data warehouse is on its way to 100% adoption. Whether these other categories will get to the same place, time will tell.
So are your customers using Fivetran to bring data from source into, let's say, Snowflake, but then also reverse from Snowflake back into the SaaS products?
Many do, and we do that ourselves with some of our own data. But like I said, it's not yet as mainstream. It doesn't have like 100% adoption. Right. Like 100% of our customers have a BI tool. What percent do reverse ETL, where they actually take the data and move it back into the SaaS tools? I don't actually know. We don't always know what our customers are doing with the data, but I'm sure it's a minority.
So, talking about your major use case, source data movement into the target, what percentage of your workloads use structured data? Do you see an increase in semi-structured, unstructured? Do you support that? How's that space morphing?
Virtually all of the data we deal with is structured. There's a little bit of a mythology around unstructured and semi-structured data. There's really not as much out there as people think. It's kind of like that meme where the Scooby-Doo crew finds the villain and they pull the mask off and it's something else. It's like, oh, I have semi-structured data, and then you pull the mask off. Actually, it's pretty structured. So we replicate a lot of data sources that I guess are semi-structured, like event data, where it's technically a JSON blob that we're delivering to the destination, but in reality, there's almost always a repeating structure in that data that we're delivering. So it's all pretty structured, and we don't deal with things like images and audio recordings and stuff like that. We've thought about it. We've seen some interest from customers, like, for example, oh, I'd like to deliver my audio recordings from my sales enablement tools for my sales calls, and then I can do like sentiment analysis, and like maybe one of my reps is just like really mean to everyone, and that's why their conversion rate is bad, and I can figure that out using the data warehouse. I think it's not, we've not gotten enough asked for it to prioritize it and build it. In principle, it's a thing we could do, but it hasn't happened yet.
So there is this whole concept of, moving data from source to target using Fivetran and some other products that are in the market. Then there's a second school of thought that says, why would we move these data attributes, data elements? Why don't leave them in the place where they are and then do some sort of like data virtualization, federation at the query layer? How do you see that data virtualization space versus a data movement space?
Well, data virtualization is a lovely idea. It's something that everyone, the concept is wonderful. You just read the data where it is and there is no movement. And in many ways, Fivetran's goal is to give you the user experience of data virtualization, where it's as though you're querying the data from the source directly. Well, under the hood, the implementation is data movement. So it has a wonderful promise. It's not possible to do for most data sources. Data virtualization does not work, and in fact cannot work for most data sources. And the reason is that the sources, the systems of record for these data sources, whether it's Salesforce or your Postgres database or you name it, simply does not give you enough read throughput to serve real world workloads. If you're going to have lots of people querying this data, and it literally, there isn't enough bandwidth to get the data out fast enough. And so data virtualization, it works in demos. It has a great demo. And it does work for data sources like object storage, like S3, which actually do have that much bandwidth. So there is a scenario where it works. But for most of the systems Fivetran interacts with, like Salesforce, like operational databases, like HR systems and ERP systems tracking widgets in your factories, which are basically databases in a different wrapper, it's not possible to implement a data virtualization strategy for a production workload. It'll have a beautiful demo. It will not work when you try to do it for real.
I see. So moving on to more controversial approaches, data mesh. Do you see your clients implementing data mesh or maybe data products like CDOs? What's your...
I tell you, I don't know what data mesh is. I think it's one of these things that everyone has a different definition for it. It's kind of like whatever you want it to be, that's data mesh. It's very slippery. So I'm a bit of a skeptic on it simply because I have not yet managed to pin down a real definition of what the heck is data mesh. So I guess I will answer your question with a question. What is data mesh?
So since you've asked me and I've been looking into this, so the whole idea is how you talked about transformation is really an important piece between the data persisting and getting consumed. So we are running into cases in very large organizations that have a lot of different departments with the centralized IT team not being able to deliver the transformations on time. So the idea of data mesh is to move the data development back into the domains where the subject matter experts reside. So move some of this data engineering capabilities and have it coexist in different domains. Those domains then take responsibility and accountability for the quality of data, accessibility, availability of data, and then there's this concept of data product. So they basically build out the data outcomes like a product which has some product management discipline. And
how do these domain experts do that? Are they writing SQL views or are they building APIs or what?
So they are. That's exactly what they're doing. So they're bringing like if there's a data scientist that's allocated, then the data scientist may even be doing creating a Python based machine learning model, for instance. So it could be SQL, Python, build out APIs. So there's a big shift in skills because a lot of these domains were not used to having these skills be in-house, because they would go to the central IT team. So that's a shift which we are starting to see.
Well, I think if the definition of data mesh is that you're going to move all the data into the data warehouse, and then a distributed workforce of subject matter experts in different departments are gonna collectively curate a set of SQL views that transform that data into a format that can be consumed by others. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think if everyone's going to become a data engineer and build their own infrastructure and use APIs to communicate with each other, I think you're going to have a bad time.
Yes.
That speaks to like a larger opinion I have about this space, which is that I think the problems of data movement and of data integration in the logical sense are very different, and it's important to keep them separate in your mind. Moving the data from one system to another, like from Workday into Snowflake, is one problem, and it has, I mean, we have our way of solving it. You know, that's a problem you can, if you choose, delegate to us, and we will take responsibility for the correctness of that movement.
Yeah.
Transforming that data into a simplified, meaningful view of what is happening in your business that reflects the unique concepts of your business, that's a separate task that cannot really be automated. It fundamentally depends on subject matter experts making decisions and judgment calls and sort of editorial decisions about what is most important. And that has to be done a different way. And I think where people really get into trouble is where they start to tangle these things together and they try to simultaneously solve the problem of movement and curation. I think so. If it's a mesh of curation, then I think that's a good idea. If it's a mesh of movement, I think that's a terrible idea.
Yeah. Yeah, so I completely agree with you. In fact, I tell people, although data mesh is the decentralized way, but the curation, the development of applications is decentralized. But in my experience, when I look at what some of the more advanced companies like Roche and all are doing, they've centralized the storage layer, which is, let's say, Snowflake or BigQuery or Redshift. The JP Morgan Chase uses Redshift, for instance, to build their data mesh. So it's not like there's decentralized data movement. That's all centralized. And then the development of applications is decentralized.
Well, let me ask you a different question since I'm interviewing you now. How is this different than just like Kimball data marts? Isn't this just the old data marts again?
So, data marts were like built off data warehouse. So the whole idea was somebody would build a data mart and then they would forget about it, and then you would have all of these data marts sitting around. Now what we are saying is that when it goes into the domain, you are responsible for not just the build, also the runtime, and also the end of life for that product. So the team stays in place. So it's a product management life cycle. It's not just you build it and you move on to the next project. And over the years, people lose track of which is the single source of truths, because you got a data mart here and you got a data warehouse here and you've got another source there. So we are just trying to bring some discipline into this architecture.
I think that sounds very reasonable.
Sounds great. All right. So moving on. By the way, we are seeing this year, especially, that there's been a lot of slowdown in the technology sector. We keep hearing about layoffs. What are you seeing in Fivetran?
There are definitely macro headwinds. I mean, we see one of the things we closely track is the behavior of existing customers. And the existing customers, if you use Fivetran, you connect a bunch of data sources, you connect a destination. In most cases, once it's up and running, the data volume flowing through will be constant. If you have a company that grows really quickly, and we have had many of those cases, then this is not true. But in most of the time, Much as they wish they might, most companies don't actually grow exponentially. And however, existing Fivetran customers every month, they connect new data sources that they weren't using before. And sometimes they turn things off. They say, maybe I don't really need this data in my data warehouse. I'm just going to turn it off and save the money. And so we follow that closely. What is the net effect of people adding and removing data sources on the total amount of data moving through the system? And generally, historically, what we would see is like about a 2% lift each month from existing customers expanding their usage of Fivetran in terms of dollars of revenue, which actually means it's probably about like a 4% increase in data volume, because there's a sort of automatic discounting curve built into Fivetran as you use more. And starting about mid last year, that 2% became 0%. Like people adding things and the people removing things roughly canceled each other out. And it was negative among small companies. So we saw a lot of economizing among small companies. We saw January was actually a good month. It looked like maybe it's over, but this metric bounces around a lot, so it's too soon to say for sure. But we can definitely see the customer economizing behavior starting about halfway through last year.
I see. So so when you have so many SaaS products, how does Fivetran does a mapping, right? Source to target. So those are pre-built connectors. But the in so many of these SaaS products, the schema changes quite frequently. How does the consumer abstract itself from all the changes in the sources?
Are you thinking of a specific example of a tool that has a lot of schema changes?
Like SaaS products will add a new column, or they add a new functionality, so now the table has more columns, or they rename a column. So in general,
So like Stripe adds new features, and when they add new features, they create new attributes.
Right.
The process by which that works is we monitor the change logs of these systems, so that we can find out when they make changes that we need to update our connector to reflect. It used to be there was just a quarterly event on the calendar of the entire engineering team, which consisted of a handful of people, including myself, and we would that was our update day. Now it's a little bit more sophisticated than that. So we monitor the sources for changes. We change our implementation. For these scenarios, they're generally backwards compatible in their additions. So the consumer and when we make these changes, those new columns appear in the data warehouse one day. You've been using Fivetran's XYZ connector for the last 5 years, and then one day a new column appears. It's like, well, Stripe implemented a new feature, so we've added another column. But generally, they're not breaking changes. And so as a consumer, you don't need to do anything. Your queries will continue to work. And you only have to update them if you want to do something with this new data that's being delivered to you. There are exceptions. There are tools like Salesforce are user configurable, and so you can change them any way you want, and you can break your own queries, and that's ultimately on you. We will push the change through into your data warehouse, and then your query might break, and we find that that's generally it's actually one of the really core decisions that we had to make a long time ago. Is like, what do you do when the source gives you a breaking change? Like I said, this generally doesn't happen with things like Stripe or Facebook or things like that. It happens with user configurable systems like Salesforce or Workday or your Oracle database. You go and change the schema. Okay, the database is now giving us a different schema. There's basically 3 decisions that you can make there. One is you can simply drop the data that doesn't follow the rules and create some sort of notification for a human being to come in and clean this up. Number 2, you can try to pretend that the change didn't happen. You can try to somehow morph the new data into the old shape. And oftentimes you need a human being to tell you how to do that. So sometimes that's phase 2 of the previous system. And then the third one, which is what we do, is you just push it through. So you push the change through to the destination. And we find that is the least bad approach, because when there's a schema change in the source, either it's a schema change to something that your query doesn't rely on, like a column that you're not even referencing, or maybe you're referencing it, but you're just doing like a count, and so it doesn't matter that the type changed. So a lot of the time it just works. A lot of the time you push the schema change through, and it's an attribute that they're not even using, it's fine. And then sometimes it's going to break. But in those situations, something has to break. There are these situations where just like something has to give. And the nice thing about pushing the change through to the data warehouse is it breaks in a very obvious and visible way that can be fixed very quickly. So that's why we thought it's the least bad approach. But there is no perfect answer here. Anybody who tells you that they can just like somehow make schema changes disappear is lying.
So, one of the things that we are also seeing is this rise of table formats in the lakehouse concept, like iceberg. Do you have how does Fivetran consider these like hoodie, delta, iceberg kind of table formats, or there's no bearing? I mean, I'm just curious.
We have a data lake writer in private preview with a handful of customers right now. It's one of the hardest engineering challenges we've ever had to take on, or I should say it's a very different engineering challenge than the type of engineering challenge that we are accustomed to, because you basically have to build like the bottom end of a data warehouse in order to implement that. And so, after a lot of work and a few iterations and false starts, we do have a working system. It's still in private preview because we're still, performance and scalability are important dimensions of that, and there's still work to be done there, but it will become generally available soon. The format that it supports right now is Iceberg, and our intention is to support all the widely adopted formats. So that means supporting Delta, possibly supporting Hoodie, and possibly supporting just some of the proprietary external table formats of the data warehouses. We want to basically write this data once and then make it available for our users in whatever systems they care to read it from.
Very interesting. Going back to this example of, let's say, Stripe or Salesforce, so when you extract the data, change data, new data that's come in, or changes to the schema, where is a Fivetran's scanner or the agent sitting that is reading? Like how does that work?
There are multiple deployment options. So we typically we just run in our own environment. So it's running in Fivetran's account. It's a giant batch system. It's single tenant at the task level. So there's no danger of different customers' data being somehow intermixed. That's what most customers do. There is also the option to deploy it on your own infrastructure, and there's kind of a spectrum there. Sometimes people deploy an agent just for like performance reasons onto the database itself, and then it sends the data up to our cloud services layer, which then sends it onward to the data warehouse. You can also run Fivetran in a configuration where all of the data flows through your own environment, which we call local data processing, which is relatively rare. Fewer people need that than they think they do, but it is. We have many customers doing it today.
So when you have agent in your VPC that's connecting to the source, it's reading the data, writing to the target. So it goes through your tenant, single tenant, and then once you write it, you delete it. Is that how it works?
Sorry, who's you in this scenario?
Fivetran.
So when it's running in our environment, I wouldn't call that an agent, but I mean, that's just semantics. Yes, we are reading the data from the source. We do a certain amount of processing to get it ready to ingest in the destination. One of the great strengths of Fivetran is we tend to drive very little ingest cost on the destination. And the reason is we do a lot of preparation of the data to get it into a format that is like exactly ready to go in to the destination. It basically is a matter of like deduplication and type coercion are the primary things we're doing. And then there's a bunch of complicated things you have to do upstream in order to make it possible to do that. But that's the basic thing that we're doing. And we load it into the destination and then we delete it. We don't keep the data except in a very specific circumstance where you send us webhooks, then we do keep the data because there's nobody else who has a copy of that data and someone needs to have another copy.
Correct.
And even then, you can actually opt to store that data on your own in your own bucket, so that we literally don't have anything. Fivetran is, we're kind of like the janitor. We have all the keys on the giant key ring. But we don't actually keep anything. We just wander around. We have access to everything, but we don't retain any of your data.
Right. So when you, this is very interesting. By the way, the more I talk to you, the more I realize how much diligence needs to go into different types of approaches. Customer VPC, Fivetran VPC. How long do you store the data? The whole preparation piece seems is pretty elaborate to minimize the read ingestion overload on the sources.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that like data lakes were very challenging for us because it was a different kind of engineering challenge than we're accustomed to. The engineering challenge we're accustomed to and that we are masters of is incidental complexity. There is just so much incidental complexity in this space, and our specialty is really hiding it, figuring out, okay, how can we make choices that will work well enough for everyone that we can just hide this problem. We can deal with it in the background in an automated way, and the user doesn't have to worry about, what happens when my MongoDB database sends me a mixture of integers and strings. What do I do with that? We have a thing that we do there that works well enough that it works for everyone. And then there just doesn't need to be another setting.
Wow. So George, are you publicly able to tell us what, if you look at your target, like Snowflake, BigQuery, what percentage, what's your biggest target and what percentage of your business is that?
So the big three are Snowflake, BigQuery, and Redshift. And they have like a roughly similar number of customers. Snowflake customers do tend to be larger, so they are larger as a percentage of revenue. But in terms of customer count, those are within like the similar universe. And then Postgres is surprisingly popular as a destination, despite the fact that it isn't really an analytical database. And then Databricks, we've only supported for like a year. And it's still small, but it's growing quickly. And there's certainly lots of Databricks customers out there.
Interesting. Very good.
And then we have a handful on like SQL Server and a few other destinations.
Same question for data sources. I think Target, we kind of know Snowflake, BigQuery, Redshift, maybe Synapse. I didn't hear Synapse. But sources, how would you break down percentage of data sources?
Yeah, so originally Salesforce was our most popular connector. There's a lot of different ways to do sources, by the way. You can do it by the number of accounts. You can do it by the number of connections, which is not quite the same because you might have more than one of a same source type. You can do it by data volume. So our very first connector was Salesforce for a long time. It was our most popular connector. Not so for the last couple of years. It has been surpassed. And there's a bunch. So there's Salesforce is still big. The databases are the biggest now. The Fivetran as a business, the most important connectors by count, by revenue, by whatever metric you want to do it, are database management systems. So those are, Postgres, MySQL, Oracle, SQL Server, DB2, MongoDB, Cosmos DB, and there's a lot of databases out there, and they're often the most important data in your companies and your databases. Marketing data sources are big, like ad networks and things. Those are often, that's where people start. Google Sheets is big. Google Sheets is huge for Fivetran. It's funny, but we have a good Google Sheets connector, and it is extremely popular.
So what do the Google Sheets customers write their data into?
The data warehouse, Snowflake, BigQuery, whatever. Yeah, the tables in there. It's a very convenient way to add small amounts of ad hoc data. People always think about data warehouses as being able to process huge amounts of data. And that's true, they do, and they're very good at it. But oftentimes you need to join a really big table to a little tiny one that has some additional little key dictionary of something. And often those are maintained as Google Sheets.
Oh, wow. Very interesting. I had no idea the impact of Google Sheets, but that's great to hear. I use Google Sheets a lot. So a few years ago, you bought HVR. How has that acquisition changed your scope of work you do?
HBR really completed uh, the scope of what we could do for large enterprises, or you could say we completed each other. Before, I think Fivetran was really great at uh, replicating business applications like Salesforce or NetSuite or things like that. We were really great at replicating the types of databases that are used by younger companies, like, namely Postgres, MySQL, MongoDB, DynamoDB. We were okay at replicating Oracle and SQL Server, and we didn't replicate DB2 or HANA or a couple other things at all. And those are the mainstays of every company that's more than 20 years old. And it was a weakness. I'm not saying we were bad at it, but we were not great at it. And HBR was great at it. HBR was the greatest product that's ever been built in this space. And so by combining them together into one Fivetran, now we can do the full spectrum of things for these larger, older companies that use these systems.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Also, before you did the HVR acquisition, and since then, how has your buyer persona changed? Like who's buying Fivetran within your prospects, your customers? Is it business? Is it IT? Is it a central team? Is it departmental? How does that work?
It's all of the above happen. The HBR acquisition definitely brought in more IT buyers. It's common if you're going to replicate, a company's core Oracle databases or core SQL Server databases, that you're going to be selling to IT because they're the ones who really manage that system. So like as a proportion, IT is higher than before the acquisition. Business leaders continue to be a key constituency in buying Fivetran. Often the motivation for Fivetran is I need to know what's going on with this, with the data that is in this place, and I need to see it now. And that is the impetus for bringing Fivetran in, just because we can get things up and running very quickly, and we really reduce the maintenance cost. You can have a lot of connectors running with Fivetran and not have a lot of work to do to maintain this system because it's so automated. A small team can manage a huge array of data sources. And data teams will tell you that business leaders are always asking them for like more data, more data, more data.
So if you were to put a number, like is it 50-50 between business and IT, or you see more business users coming to Fivetran and saying we have a problem? IT is an influencer in this because they'll evaluate, but are the businesses coming to you more? IT?
I think it's still more often business leaders. The place where it starts with IT is often more like migrations, things like that. It more frequently is business leaders because the fundamental thing motivating it is the desire for access to more data.
I see.
That's ultimately the problem we solve, is like, I want to see this data too.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, IT should be working on behalf of the business. The business needs to drive intelligence or decisions, and they need access to data fast.
Yeah, I think an IT team or a data engineering team can manage the core data sources themselves if they want to. It's possible to manage like the key tables from Salesforce, the key tables from your production database, as long as you aren't making too many schema changes. A team of data engineers or IT people operating a very customization-oriented tool like Informatica or Talent can manage those data pipelines and keep them running and keep updating them as the source changes, as long as it doesn't change too fast. But if you want to really go broad and get a wide array of data sources, access to a wide array of data sources, you need to gain leverage. You need to get yourself out of the business of dealing with API changes and dealing with unexpected corner cases that only happen once a quarter. unexpected performance corner cases or some of the most challenging ones. It's like the API didn't change. It's just you hit, you hit a limit of, the page size or whatever the case may be. And that's the point where you need to think about adopting Fivetran, because our automated approach is what is going to give you that leverage to be able to go from, managing a few data sources with a team of whatever size to managing the full spectrum of data sources.
Yeah, very nice. George, you mentioned how when we were talking about the size of your source, by number of connectors, the volume of data moved, number of accounts, I think you mentioned, what is your biggest deployment? I'm curious if you can tell us, like, how big, what's the scale, largest scale that you have come across?
In terms of just like we have customers where we manage hundreds of databases for them, and terabytes of change capture each month. We have some large B2C applications that you would recognize. We're not allowed to talk about all of them, but that, like a meaningful fraction of the population of Earth is using some of these applications that we're moving. I do like to think about it that way sometimes with these really big database deployment. It's like, okay, how many tens or hundreds of millions of people are inputting data into these databases, and what percentage of the human population is that? So it gets really big. Some of those, especially B2C databases that we move, are gigantic.
Can you mention any names, like some public reference where Fivetran is used?
Square is a big public reference that we do a lot of work for their marketing team. And who else? Gosh, I need to get I should have made marketing give me the list before this.
Yeah, it's okay.
Pitney Bowes is a big one, and they're not as well known because they're more of like a behind the scenes company, but they certainly move a lot of data. Pitney Bowes.
Pitney Bowes, yes. Yeah. We are very interested.
But the ones I really want to mention, I'm not sure whether we actually have authorization. Yeah. I should check our customer page.
So since we're talking about these customers, are there any use cases that surprised you and you say, wow, that's something unique we have not come across? Have you seen cases like that?
Yeah, some of the ones that really surprised me are when people use them for operational workloads. We think of data warehouses as primarily serving reporting, but people have used Fivetran to run payroll. They've used Fivetran to keep track of trucks. So it's interesting. People actually do a lot of applications built on top of their data warehouse, because, as a friend of mine said, data attracts workloads. And so I've been really surprised by some of the oddball operational use cases people have done, and very mission critical operational use cases. It's made me appreciate Fivetran really cannot go down.
Oh, wow. Actually, I had questions on that, like how do you maintain reliability, HADR, but I was thinking maybe that's a bit too detailed for this. But if you want, since you mentioned it cannot go down, how do you maintain high availability?
Well, the core principle that Fivetran is built on is idempotency, which means that if you're not sure whether you succeeded at something, you can always do it a second time. And if you do something over, it's okay. It'll just have no effect. All Fivetran pipelines work like this at a very deep level. And what that means is we can always retry. And that allows us to automatically recover from failure. And that means that, oddly enough, failure is sort of okay as long as you catch yourself quickly. So our whole system is basically designed to fail fast and retry, and then we monitor it. Religiously, and we're always watching for when there are changes in sources that cause a whole bunch of connectors to go down at once, and then we just jump on it and fix it really, really fast. Those are the kind of two key pillars of it, really.
So if you run a pipeline and for some reason, there's a failure in that availability zone, the pipeline fails. So if you rerun it, how do you make sure that you're not going to duplicate some data or there's like integrity problems because half the data got written? How are those checks done?
Yeah, it's this principle of idempotence. You have to make sure that every stage of the pipeline is idempotent. So it's like a precept across all of our engineering that we make sure that everything we do is idempotent, and the person who writes the connector needs to respect it, and the person who writes the core engine needs to respect it, and the person who writes the data lake writer implementation or data destination writer implementation needs to respect it. And if every single step of the pipe is idempotent, then the whole system is collectively idempotent, and that means it's okay if you go back and fetch the same thing twice. It won't duplicate, it won't cause a data integrity violation.
Very nice. I have a very basic question. Why is the company called Fivetran?
Well, that's a pun on Fortran, which made more sense with like one of the early ideas about what we would do. But that idea went by the wayside, and we sort of kept the name, and it worked out for us. I like it. It's easy enough to remember. It doesn't really mean anything, and it's unique. If you Google Fivetran, you're only going to find us.
Yeah, that is good. So, but it's interesting you mentioned Fortran because I sometimes joke when I graduated, I only had to learn two computer languages in my graduation, Fortran and Pascal. So that's a long time ago.
I was going to guess that if you were a little older, it would be Fortran and PL1, but
yeah, that escaped me. Yeah.
My aunt was a PL1 programmer.
Oh, wow. How was your journey? You mentioned beginning of this episode, you were a scientist when you started your career to being a founder, running this. So one of the questions that I ask as we come to the close of the podcast is, what are some of the lessons that you've learned that you could share with the community?
Just running Fivetran, or?
No, just in general, like, what are some words of wisdom?
Well, I did follow an unusual journey to being the CEO of a technology company. I was a scientist beforehand. I have a PhD in neuroscience. And one thing that I took away from that experience was what I'm doing today doesn't have a lot to do with what I studied in graduate school, what I worked on, what my papers were about. It really has nothing to do with it. And that's okay. I think sometimes people focus too much, especially people who go into fields like natural sciences or history or writing plays or who knows what. It's okay. Not every stage of your life needs to be leading logically into the next one. It's okay to just have that be a thing that you did for a while and it was a great experience, and now you're going to do something different.
Very nice. Yeah. Tell us something about you that the world doesn't know widely. Something interesting.
I have a Labradoodle who I am very fond of, and he's usually fond of me unless I don't take him on enough walks.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, George. It's been such a pleasure to have you on this episode. We learned a lot, and wish you all the more success. Fivetran's been top of its game. So
Thank you very much. This has been fun.
You're welcome. Take care. Thanks, everyone. Bye.